what is Vatican II? A lot of Catholics have heard of the Second Vatican Council, but they don't really know all that much about it. Maybe they heard it mentioned once in a homily or heard someone mention one of its documents in a talk at the parish, but a lot of Catholics still don't really know what it taught. And yet, in the last year or two, there's been a lot of confusion and controversy about Vatican II in the Catholic social media world. There's been some people that are even claiming that the council was heretical or contained errors, or that we don't have to assent to it. There's been some claims about what it teaches about different topics, such as non-Christian religions, religious liberty, ecumenism, interreligious dialogue, and the possibility of salvation for non-Catholics. And so there's been a lot of confusion about these topics, and we here at Word on Fire would like to help correct that so that you have access to a better understanding of the Second Vatican Council. My name is Dr. Richard DeClue, and I have the privilege of being able to lead you through a 6-part series to help you understand this council better. Now, this approach will be a little bit different than what I might usually do in a course in Vatican II. Typically, I would take the students through one document at a time in succession. But this time, I'd like to take a salvation historical approach, which is more narrative and thematic in character, drawing from several documents in each lesson to help show how they illuminate a particular theme. And the way that I would like to progress through these lessons will be in this first lesson, we'll just answer the question, what is Vatican II, by exploring what ecumenical councils are, how they get their name, who presided over the council, what were the historical background to the council, as well as enumerate the documents that it produced. Then, in the subsequent lessons, we'll start learning about what the council actually taught in the documents. We'll start with our common humanity, where we learn about what all humans have in common, whether Catholic or non-Catholic, Christian or non-Christian. And as a part of that, we'll learn other things, such as what other religions have tried to do regarding searching for the truth. We'll learn what religious liberty really means. We'll also learn in lessons what the role is of the Church, the Catholic Church, in salvation history. We'll learn about the importance of her doctrines and her sacraments. We'll discuss the relationship of the Church to others from outside of the Church, including other Christians through ecumenism, her relationship to non-Christians through interreligious dialogue, and finally, her missionary activity, her mission of going forth and proclaiming the gospel to everyone. And so today, let's start into this discussion of what is the Second Vatican Council. First of all, what are ecumenical councils? Ecumenical councils are gatherings of bishops from around the world where those bishops try to answer questions of doctrine or discipline for the church. So it can be a matter of teaching the faith in reaction to a particular heresy that's cropped up, or it could be trying to decide what sort of laws or practices would be good for the church in a given era. Some councils deal with doctrine and practice, some deal with just one or the other. Some deal with both. Now, ecumenical councils, the term ecumenical, refers to the fact that these bishops are coming from all over the world, not just this particular region. In order for a council to be considered ecumenical, though, it has to be presided over either by the Pope or someone he delegates. The delegates would be called legates in the history of the Church. And any document that an ecumenical council produces has to be approved and ratified by the Pope in order for it to be included as official church teaching. So, before the schism between the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches, there were 8 ecumenical councils, the first 7 of which Catholics and Orthodox alike accept as authentic ecumenical councils. Those occurred between the 4th and 9th centuries, but the Catholic Church has continued to have them ever since. Now, councils are named after the city in which the bishops gather. So the very first ecumenical council took place in Nicaea, and therefore it's known as the Council of Nicaea. It's also where we get the term Nicene Creed. Now, after that Council of Nicaea, which was in 325 AD, you had some other councils, such as in Ephesus, Constantinople, Chalcedon, and the like. But then the Seventh Ecumenical Council was also in Nicaea. Therefore, it is known as Nicaea II, or the Second Council of Nicaea. So similarly then, you can understand why Vatican II is called Vatican II, or the Second Vatican Council, because it was the second council and the second in a row to be held at the Vatican in Rome. And so that's how they are named. Now, you might be wondering, why is it that the First Ecumenical Council didn't take place until 325 AD? Just as a quick historical reference, there's one very good reason for that. As you might already be aware, it was for many centuries illegal to be Christian in the Roman Empire. And many of the first popes were actually martyred. They were killed. Likewise with bishops and other believers were persecuted by the Roman Empire. And it wasn't until about 313 AD with the Edict of Milan that it became broadly and widely legal to be Christian in the Roman Empire. And therefore, the First Ecumenical Council actually took place fairly shortly after that persecution had ended in the Roman Empire. So that's one good historical note. Now, Vatican II is the 21st Ecumenical Council. And it's the second in a row in the Vatican, as I mentioned. But in order to understand Vatican II, we need to take a little bit of a step back and see the wider historical context. And so we're going to go back to Vatican I. The First Vatican Council took place between 1869 and 1870. But even before it began in 1869, there were 5 years of work in preparing for that council to be called. And initially, that council was going to deal with a broad range of topics regarding doctrine and discipline alike. There were actually about 51 documents that were prepared for that council. But the Franco-Prussian War broke out, and the council was prematurely ended, and it only ended up issuing 2 documents. Vatican I is most well known for having dogmatized the doctrine of papal infallibility. But that dogma was meant to take place within the context of a broader document on the Church. Since that didn't happen at Vatican I, when Vatican II was called, it ended up picking up a lot of those themes that were meant to be discussed in Vatican I, but were never done. So that's an important thing to keep in mind about the council. It was trying to pick up where Vatican I had left off. But let's zoom in a little bit to the historical context of the Second Vatican Council itself. First of all, in October 28th, 1958, Giuseppe Roncalli was elected as Pope, and he took the name Pope John the 23rd. Now, he was elected just shy of his 77th birthday, and he was sort of expected to be a transitional pope. It's not uncommon after a long reign, the prior pope, Pius XII, had reigned for almost 20 years, for the College of Cardinals to elect a somewhat more elderly pope to have a shorter papal reign before you end up having a longer reign in the future. It's considered kind of a breathing space, a transitional pope, if you will. So they didn't really expect that John the 23rd would do a whole lot, and yet only 3 months into holding the papal office, he announced that he planned to call an ecumenical council, much to everyone's surprise. And that took place in early 1959. Now, the official opening of the council didn't take place until October 11th, 1962. And so there were over 3 years of preparation between the time he announced the council and the time it actually officially commenced. And there were a lot of commissions that were established to help prepare documents for the council. They were sent to the bishops. They got feedback from them. So there was a lot of work that went into the council in advance of it actually starting. But it started in October 1962. It was presided over by Pope John the 23rd, who has since been canonized and therefore is now known as Pope St. John the 23rd. So, who are the participants of the Second Vatican Council? Well, first of all, you have the voting members. The voting members of an ecumenical council are the bishops themselves. And at Vatican II, there were about 2,540 bishops present. That is far and away the largest number of bishops to ever attend an ecumenical council. Just compare it to Vatican I, which had only about 700-something bishops attend. Additionally, Vatican II truly had a global representation of bishops from all over the globe, including South America, Africa, and Asia, which meant that the church was widely represented from all over the world at this council. You also had what were known as theological experts called periti in the plural or peritus in the singular. And these were basically advisors to the bishops. They would sometimes give talks to the bishops, they would answer questions from bishops, and they would also be on drafting committees that helped to generate documents and revise documents according to what the bishops wanted to do. So that was their task. One of these periti was Joseph Ratzinger, who eventually became Pope Benedict XVI. He was a young theologian at the time at the University of Bonn, and Cardinal Frings of Cologne, which is nearby, asked him to be his expert and got him appointed as an official expert at the council. So, in addition to the voting members and to the theological experts, you also had some observers that were invited. These were Protestant and Eastern Orthodox that were invited to attend the council, but not as participants. They weren't allowed to partake in the deliberations, they weren't allowed to vote, but they were allowed to actually watch the discussions and see what was taking place. Now, there have been some people that have criticized Vatican II for inviting Protestants and Orthodox to observe this. However, it's really not new to Vatican II. The Council of Trent, which was part of the Counter-Reformation, invited Protestant reformers to attend the council to try to help put an end to the division that the Reformation had taken place. Likewise, Vatican I invited Protestants, Orthodox, and other non-Catholics to attend the council as observers. Now, it just so happens that those invitations were declined in those prior councils, so Vatican II was the first time that you had these outside observers. But the offer of the invitation was nothing new. There was precedent in prior tradition to do so. Okay. There's another important aspect to Vatican II that I think can sometimes be forgotten. This was the first ecumenical council to take place during the time of mass media. It was the first council to take place even when there were things as simple as typewriters, telephones, and nevertheless, radio and television and the like. And there was an extensive amount of media coverage of the Second Vatican Council. And that's something that I don't think we can take too lightly, because there was a lot of speculation and confusion that took place in the media about what the council was intending to do or about what it was doing. A lot of Catholics relied on the media coverage, the secular media coverage included, for their understanding what was taking place at the council. And you might have interviews with theologians and others saying what they thought the council would do or what they hoped it would do, or giving their understanding of what it actually was doing. And unfortunately, those reports were not always accurate, but the people at home didn't have any other way of knowing what was actually taking place. So there were a lot of things that were expected to come out of the council based on what media was reporting that didn't actually take place and that weren't actually true. And unfortunately, some of the confusion has continued to this day. which is why it's important for us to actually look at the documents themselves to find out what the Second Vatican Council did really teach. Now, why was the Second Vatican Council called? What was the reason that Pope John XXIII called an ecumenical council? Well, there's really three main reasons, and they are all related. First, you have twin hopes of the council, which were renewal from within, so to renew the life of the Catholic Church from within, and reunion. Now, this is reunion with other Christians. So these were called the twin hopes of the council, renewal from within and reunion from without. These, in turn, were meant to also serve what you might call the overarching purpose of the council, which was missionary. It wanted to proclaim the gospel and the truth of the Catholic faith to the whole world, so that Catholics, non-Catholic Christians, and non-Christians alike could have abundant understanding of what the Church taught and why. Now, Pope John XXIII wanted the council to take on a pastoral approach. Now, sometimes that term pastoral is misunderstood, and it can also often be used pejoratively. And so I want to pause for a moment and focus in on that term pastoral. What does that really mean in the context of an ecumenical council? Well, first of all, Pope John XXIII wanted to avoid overly technical language in the council's documents. It wanted it to speak in more colloquial terms, terms that the average person could understand, so that it would have a greater effect in their lives. Most people then and even today are not familiar with technical, scholastic, philosophical terminology, and so he wanted it to avoid those sorts of things, and instead use current literary forms and manners of speaking. But what pastoral does not mean, and sometimes people think that it means this, but it does not mean watering down the faith or compromising the Church's doctrine. In fact, John XXIII himself declared the council's intention as to give the world the whole of that doctrine, to transmit it in all its purity, undiluted, undistorted. Now, he did also call for a positive presentation of the faith. Now, what does that mean? It means a couple of things. First, many ecumenical councils from the past had taught via condemning errors. They called these anathemas. Anyone who says heresy X, let him be anathema, right? And so it was sort of a way of negating falsehood and therefore affirming a truth through that negation. Instead, Pope John XXIII wanted to avoid doing that and instead emphasize what the Church actually believes herself instead of pointing out just what she doesn't believe. It also did, in a certain sense, want to use more positive language because the gospel is good news, after all. And so it wanted to have this love for the teachings of the Church, and therefore have a positive tone in general. But what that does not mean that the council was meant to avoid harsh truths. As we go through these lessons, you'll see that there's pretty strong language used in the council at various points, saying very hard truths that some people might find difficult. And it didn't avoid those things at all. All right. John XXIII said that he wanted the positive presentation without forfeiting that accuracy and precision in its presentation which characterized the proceedings of the Council of Trent, as well as the First Vatican Council. I think this is important because sometimes Vatican II has been accused of being a break from the past, and that's simply not the case. John XXIII highlights Trent and Vatican I as a way of showing the fact that Vatican II is meant to be in the footsteps, in continuity with those prior councils. There's also another reason, a very personal reason. Long before he was pope, actually shortly after he was ordained a priest in 1904, John XXIII, then Father Roncalli, was ordained for the Diocese of Bergamo in Italy, which is near the Archdiocese of Milan. 2 years after his ordination, he began teaching at a seminary, and his subject matter was church history. So, since he was so close to Milan, he would avail himself of the Ambrosian Library in Milan. And he visited the archives there many times. Well, during his search, he actually found 39 bound volumes of documents talking about his Diocese of Bergamo and the era following the Council of Trent. As the scholar Jared Wicks notes, Roncalli was enthused about so many and such interesting documents regarding the Church of Bergamo from the era marked by the renewal of its religious life after the Council of Trent. Here was evidence of the warm fervor of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. At the heart of this were volumes 6 and 7. Volumes 6 and 7 of that 39-volume collection represented and recorded St. Charles Borromeo's apostolic visitation to Bergamo as the Archbishop of Milan. So there were these 2 volumes giving the records of what St. Charles Borromeo did to implement the Council of Trent. It so happens that Roncalli then spent decades in various fits and starts trying to prepare those records for wider publication. As Wicks reports, Roncalli trained seminarians to transcribe the Latin texts of relevant correspondence, reports on churches, parish life, clergy, and other institutions, and ordinances of reform issued by St. Charles. He began this work in 1910 and went all the way up to 1914, and then there was many years of a break. But the first 3 parts were not published until 1936, 1937, and 1938. And then the last 2 parts were not published until 1946 and 1959. 1959. That date might ring a bell. When did John the 23rd announce that he planned to call an ecumenical council? 1959. I don't think that's a coincidence. You see, John the 23rd was so inspired by how effective St. Charles Borromeo's reforms and implementation of the Council of Trent were, that he desired a similar renewal for the entire church. And he hoped that calling an ecumenical council might be the renewal that the church needed. So his very inspiration for calling a council comes from the Council of Trent. John the 23rd also gives his account of what the doctrinal goals were. Because you have some people that think that the council was meant to be a rupture from the past, as we mentioned, which isn't the case. And we hear in his own words, what is needed and what everyone imbued with a truly Christian, Catholic, and apostolic spirit craves today is that this doctrine shall be more widely known, more deeply understood, and more penetrating in its effects on men's moral lives. What is needed is that this certain and immutable doctrine, to which the faithful owe obedience, be studied afresh and reformulated in contemporary terms. For this deposit of faith, or truths which are contained in our time-honored teaching, is one thing. The manner in which these truths are set forth, with their meaning intact, is something else. Notice the reference here to immutability or unchangeability and of obedience owed to this long-standing teaching and tradition. There's no hint in John the 23rd's words of any desire for some radical change or break from the past. So we need to understand this church in light of the tradition, in light of the aims of the very Pope that called the council. Now, when did the council actually take place? We already saw that it started in October of 1962, and it lasted until 1965. But there were 4 sessions, so it wasn't a contiguous gathering. They broke up into 4 sessions, one each year. Now, after the first session, but before the beginning of the second, Pope St. John the 23rd died. He died on June 3rd, 1963. His successor, who's known as Paul VI, was elected on June 21st, 1963, and that was Cardinal Montini, taking the name Pope Paul VI. He immediately announced upon his election that he would continue the council, so it wouldn't end. Some people were worried that, well, maybe he's not going to continue the council, but as soon as he was elected, he let people know that he intended to continue the council. So, what did the council actually end up producing? There are 16 documents that the Second Vatican Council promulgated. I'm not going to write them all down for you, but we will go through them. There are different types of documents. First of all, we have dogmatic constitutions. There are only 2 of these, and these are the ones that carry the most weight when it comes to the level of teaching. Those were Dei Verbum, which is on divine revelation, and Lumen Gentium, which is the dogmatic constitution on the church. Then there was also a pastoral constitution, and just one of those, and that was Gaudium et Spes, the church in the modern world. Then we have another document that's just called a constitution, and that was Sacrosanctum Concilium, which was on the liturgy. There were also 9 decrees. Now, decrees are not just about doctrine, they're also and primarily about what should be done. And so those 9 decrees were Christus Dominus on the pastoral office of bishops in the church, Presbyterorum Ordinis on the ministry and life of priests, Optatum Totius on the training of priests, Perfectae Caritatis on the up-to-date renewal of religious life, Apostolicam Actuositatem on the apostolate of the laity, Ad Gentes Divinitus, or most often just called Ad Gentes, is on the church's missionary activity. Unitatis Redenter Gratio is on ecumenism. Orientalem Ecclesiarum is on the Eastern Catholic churches. Inter Marifica is on the mass media. And then finally, there were 3 declarations. And similar to the dogmatic constitutions, the declarations are doctrinal statements, but they're much shorter than the constitutions were. Those 3 were Dignitatis Humanae, which is on religious liberty, Nostra Aetate, on the relation of the church to non-Christian religions, and Gravissimum Educationis, on Christian education. Now, we're not going to be able to go through all of those documents in this series, of course. As I said, we're sticking to a particular theme of salvation history. But I also want to address the ongoing confusion that still seems to happen today regarding the council. I want to assure you that this is nothing new in church history. There has been confusion after pretty much every ecumenical council. And to highlight that, I want to read this quote, and I'm not going to tell you who it's from right at the beginning. I'll wait and hold off. But listen to this and see if it sounds familiar to your own experience of our present day. The raucous shouting of those who through disagreement rise up against one another, the incomprehensible chatter, the confused din of uninterrupted clamoring has now filled almost the whole church, falsifying through excess or failure the right doctrine of the faith. Now, that might sound like it was just written yesterday, and it might be speaking about our own day where there's all this clamoring and fighting about the Second Vatican Council on Catholic social media. that was written by St. Basil the Great. St. Basil the Great was born in 330 AD, 5 years after the Council of Nicaea. So when he describes the situation of his own day, he's talking about what was taking place decades after the Council of Nicaea. So even after the first ecumenical council, there was confusion and fighting and people misrepresenting what the doctrine was to one extreme or the other. That's actually why we needed some of the subsequent ecumenical councils, such as Ephesus and Chalcedon, to address other disputes that were still taking place even after Nicaea. That quote was given to the Roman Curia by Pope Benedict XVI in 2005, as he tried to give us an idea of how we should understand the Second Vatican Council. In that famous address to the Roman Curia, Pope Benedict XVI spoke about two different ways of interpreting the Council that have come up and arisen since the time of the Council. One is the hermeneutic of rupture that I was mentioning before, where people thought that the Council was meant to be this radical break from the past and some sort of liberation from the history of the Church in bygone years. This is contrasted by him with what is known as the hermeneutic of reform or continuity, which stresses the fact that the Council must be read in continuity with the Church's entire tradition and seen as a faithful progression in advancing forward of the Church's doctrine, rather than something betraying it and leaving it behind. These two different ways of understanding the Council have continued to create problems in the Church even today. On the one side, you have progressives that try to downplay the need to be faithful to the tradition of the Church in her past and try to emphasize that even Vatican II itself didn't go far enough and we should just continue to go forth in the spirit of Vatican II, which is a common phrase you might hear associated with this hermeneutic of rupture. The spirit of Vatican II, however, very often is not faithful to the actual documents of Vatican II, which means it's not a true spirit of that council at all. And Pope Benedict XVI highlights the fact that the council must be understood in continuity, and he uses the same quotes that we used from Pope John the 23rd to highlight that fact, to show that the council itself understood that it was in continuity with the past. And we'll also see this reflected time and again in the documents that we discussed throughout this course. The conciliar and post-conciliar popes all held this hermeneutic of continuity. And therefore, that is the authentic understanding of the council. Bishop Barron himself has stated this. He says, "I and Word on Fire stand firmly with Vatican II, and hence against the radical traditionalists. And we stand firmly with the Wojtyla-Ratzinger interpretation of the council, and hence against the progressives." So that is the stance that we will take in this series. It is the stance taken by the magisterium since the council, and is the only authentically Catholic way of understanding the council, that it is not a break from the past, it is in continuity with the Church's rich doctrinal history. Now, relatedly, I like to speak about Assent Ode to Vatican II, because this has been another point of contention. Some people say, well, Vatican II didn't solemnly define any new dogmas or infallible doctrines, and therefore I don't really have to give any assent to it. I can just sort of brush it aside as something that's completely irrelevant to me or my life. But that is not the case. We'll get into the specifics about different types of assent in a later lesson, but just listen to these words of Pope Paul VI. "But the Council has invested its teachings with the authority of the supreme ordinary magisterium, which ordinary magisterium is so obviously authentic that it must be accepted with docility and sincerity by all the faithful, according to the mind of the Council as expressed in the nature and aims of the individual documents. Now, one thing that I would like to remind you of is that the magisterium alone has the authority to interpret authoritatively Scripture and tradition. And so it is the magisterium herself to whom we must give our assent when the magisterium tells us what the tradition holds. Individual commentators online or wherever you might be do not have the authority to interpret the council. The magisterium has been clear and stated repeatedly that Vatican II is in continuity with Catholic tradition, and therefore the council must be interpreted accordingly. I want to thank you for your time and attention today, and I look forward to going through the rest of this course with you. And I hope it will be clarifying for any questions you might have regarding these difficult topics, and I hope that you'll have a greater appreciation of how all of these different areas of doctrine coalesce into one grand mystery of salvation, the mystery of our faith. God bless.